Hello. So now that I've remembered to hit the video camera instead of just the camera, um, let's talk about asking people sensitive questions when doing health research and how you handle the questions, how you handle the responses. These were actually 2 separate weeks of readings when I was taking the course, but I decided to put them together, partly because they're just so closely related and partly because tomorrow is New Year's and I'm obviously not going to be coming to the library on New Year's because they're not open and I actually have other things to do. So let me jump right in because there's quite a few articles since I combined them. The first one, Heck et al. From 2006, Healthcare Access Among Individuals Involved in Same-Sex Relationships, is one that I want to come back to once I've taken some more epidemiology and biostatistics, which I'm hoping to start doing as of next fall. Once I complete this certificate, I'm hoping to do the certificate in epi and biostats. And maybe the regression analysis will make more sense then, because it's been a few years since I took statistics and it was never my favorite subject. I'm one of those math people who would much rather do calculus than statistics. But I need to get a better grip on it. And I will probably have more thoughts about how that data was analyzed when I can look at the math a little more knowledgeably. Next up, the next 2 entries are actually all from the same book, which is Doing Research on Sensitive Topics, and talks about how to get people comfortable enough to answer questions on things that they might not be comfortable answering. One of the key examples is substance use. Some substances are not only socially undesirable, but also illegal. So people will be very reluctant to admit that they use them. And one of the later entries actually talks about that in a little more detail. The example that was given to sort of load a question to make somebody more comfortable answering it, I worry plays into a different sort of bias. Because if you've told somebody from the beginning, so doctors believe, or some doctors believe, that drinking red wine is helpful for heart health. Have you had any wine in the past week, month, whatever? So somebody who had been might otherwise have been reluctant to answer the question about drinking wine might think, oh, well, yeah, it's okay to answer this. But here's the other thing. That's like asking somebody how often they exercise. Because when we ask people about alcohol, it's a truism among nurses that you have to double it because people are always going to lowball it, either because they don't realize how much they drink or because they're deliberately cutting it down to something they think is a little more acceptable. And on the flip side, if you ask somebody how often they exercise, there's a very good chance that they're going to overestimate how often they exercise, either because they'll think of how often they intend to exercise or because they feel that the interviewer is looking for a healthy response and will give that. So my concern is, okay, now you've got the people who would have been reluctant to say they had drunk wine are now willing to, but now are other people going to say, oh yes, I have a glass of wine with dinner every night, and they have not. And so whatever it is you're looking for is going to be muddied by that fact. Also talks a bit about how you handle sensitive data. It is a bit dated for that because it's pre-HIPAA. So probably not as useful in that, although it's still the ethical issues are timeless. That you want to make sure that how you are handling people's sensitive information is keep protecting them. And there was more about that in the Ethics Week, and I'll link that in the blog post. The Pathella et al. Article talked about discordance between sexual behavior and self-reported sexual identity. And it was a population-based survey of men in New York City using random digit dialing. So it first of all only got people who had landlines, essentially, which I suppose in 2006, or well, it would have been earlier than that it was actually done, probably a reasonable approach. Now you would have to make sure that you were covering mobile phones or you're just going to miss way too many people because too many people don't even have or don't answer landlines anymore. I know I don't. And the topic of does a person's sexual behavior match their sexual orientation identity is one that always perks my ears up, because I'm usually looking at it from the sense of, are we invalidating somebody's sexual orientation identity if they are plurisexual, meaning bisexual, pansexual, omnisexual, but happen to be in a committed relationship or happen to be not in a relationship at all, or just are having a dry spell. So that's the angle I often am predisposed to look at the question from. They were looking at the more commonly examined angle, which is people who are engaging in same-sex relationships but do not, their sexual orientation identity doesn't cover that. Although they did also look at people who are engaging in different gender relationships whose sexual orientation identity didn't cover that, which as a result means that all the men who identified themselves as bisexual, they were counted in the first couple of rounds of analysis, just in terms of how many there were, but then they weren't considered any further, because obviously the research question is only looking at people whose sexual orientation identity doesn't match their sexual behavior. And if you're already saying that you're open to at least having relationships with people of any biological sex, then that's not going to really fit into their paradigm. So I get why they were left out. Part of me still wishes they had analyzed the data further anyway, but I do understand why it was left out. I am probably going to mangle the first name, or the name of the first author here, Tourango and Yan, from 2007, talk about sensitive questions and surveys, similar to the chapters from Lee, but actually does some statistical analysis on existing studies about the error that's introduced by whatever type of bias is introduced by the methods that are employed to try to get this data. One of the most interesting was this Villarreal et al. 2008 article, telephone and computer assisted self-interviewing was shown to reduce bias in STD measurements. So some of the earlier readings, particularly the ones from Lee, had talked about how having a phone interviewer increased response rates from having a face-to-face interviewer. This actually looked at, okay, so it's a phone interview, but it's not even a person, it's a computer. And it did seem to increase response rates. So people did seem to feel more comfortable talking to a computer than they did talking to a person, even a person who was just on the other end of a phone, which that's very interesting. And probably not likely to lead to the sort of over-reporting that the earlier method I talked about might. So that's the articles from this week. It actually is reminding me of a book that I heard about a couple of months ago on difficult conversations, not sensitive questions, but difficult conversations. And I need to find that book, read it, and probably do a review of it, which leads me to the other thing, which is I had been thinking about whether for the new year I should create a side blog on here, which would end up being called Nursing Geek, because all the rest of my online stuff is Nursing Geek pretty much. But that actually kind of doesn't make sense. I'm just going to keep any of the things that I might be interested in blogging about that are not directly research related over on Tumblr, which is my main Nursing Geek outlet. And it's much more of a potpourri of this, that, and the other thing, rather than have yet another thing to maintain on the internet, because now we're up to a WordPress, a Tumblr, a Twitter, although the Twitter pretty much just takes everything from Tumblr. I don't actually use it directly all that often, and now YouTube. That's plenty. That's more than plenty. Oh, and Instagram, because the university got me doing Instagram when they had their ugly sweater thing earlier this month. So yeah, that's plenty of social media for me. Plenty of official social media. Don't need to be adding anything else. So what I probably will do is maybe every so often do a roundup on here, on here is YouTube, on WordPress, and maybe also in description boxes on YouTube that says what the latest batch of stuff over on Tumblr is, which a lot of it is reblogs of other people's things. I'm not going to list that, but anything that's actually original content. Which that's one of my New Year's goals, is a little more in the way of original content. Obviously, this week has been a bit of a blitz of original content because I'm playing catch up. That is not going to continue because starting next Monday, I'm in another class, and then starting a couple weeks after that, I'm teaching a bunch of classes, as well as still taking a class. But my goal is to have, my Tumblr goal is to have at least some kind of original content every month, and at least something being posted to the blog every week. That's a really lowball goal, but that's more consistency than I've been doing over the past year. On here, it'll probably be a bit more frequent because, well, YouTube will end up having things that go to both, most likely, and WordPress will just continue chipping away at the ever-growing bibliography, and at some point I'm going to have to create some master posts to just collect all these entries. But in the meantime, we'll stick with this format. If you have any thoughts, questions on any of this stuff, please leave me a comment and ask. I would love to have a conversation about it. And otherwise, I'm just going to be on my way and say Happy New Year. Bye.